Welcome everyone, welcome to Queen's University, welcome to the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and welcome, if I may, to the School of Law. My name is Adrienne Scullion and I have the very wonderful job here at Queen's of being the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for this faculty, for the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. And it's really on behalf of our scholarly community that I welcome you here this evening, and a really key moment in the life of our scholarly community when we celebrate excellence and we celebrate the academically scholarly excellence of one of our colleagues, Professor Anne-Marie McAlinden. I think one of the things that is wonderful about my job is that I do very often get to celebrate the work that we do as researchers and as teachers in this great university. And I think it's really important that as we celebrate our students' achievements at graduation, as we celebrate our colleagues' achievements when they're publishing books, that we also mark that very special day in the life of an academic when a chair is bestowed, when a chair is achieved, when they become a professor. It's very something that people really aspire to, and it always is a special moment in anyone's scholarly life, and I think a wonderful reflection of the scholarly community that people work within. So it's a celebration of everyone in the School of Law when we celebrate the success of Anne-Marie. But also I know also a wonderful evening for Anne-Marie's family as well, to recognise that none of us achieve the work we do without the work of our scholarly family, but also our own family and friends that support us along the way. So Anne-Marie's family, you're jolly welcome here this evening. Really, I just wanted to welcome everyone, and I did also want to say just a small thanks to my colleague Michael Alcorn, who has been really active in ensuring that as a faculty we just reconstitute this special event of marking an inaugural lecture, of really inviting us together as a community of scholars to mark these really significant moments in the life of our schools and our disciplines. And we're hoping that we're going to have an ongoing calendar of events like this, that really we're going to share the work, celebrate the work that we do, and make that a little bit more visible within the university and out with the university. So I'm really delighted that Anne-Marie's been an early adopter of that work, and that maybe I'll be able to invite you all back a subsequent inaugural lecture as we go through the year. I guess one of the definitions of the job that many of us do as academics is to find out more about something that we're interested in and share that with other people. And we share that with other people through publishing our research and pursuing our teaching. And it's a very wonderful, privileged position to be in, to have a job that says, find out more about what you're interested in and tell other people about it. And I think what's remarkable about the work that Anne-Marie does is how important the work that she's interested in is, how essential it is, how timely it is. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about that today. And I recognise that that's something that really drives the intellectual project of the School of Law, that actually the work that you're doing, the work that you want to achieve is important, has resonance. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that from Anne-Marie, and perhaps also I note that is very much part of the feature of Phil's own work as well, when Phil introduces Anne-Marie in a moment. So you're all very welcome. On behalf of the university, Anne-Marie, congratulations. We're really excited about what happens next, what you're going to do next in your role as a professor, because we're always moving forward. But I think recognising here tonight that there's a wonderful community of scholarship here supporting you, and that you're very much part of and playing a leading role within. So Anne-Marie, congratulations, and I really look forward to find out more about the work that you're doing.
This is a really significant moment for family, and for friends, and for colleagues, and for those in the wider community. It's a tremendous tribute to Anne-Marie, and I wanted to just say a few words before we start and before Anne-Marie starts. I'm Phil Scraton, and I'm Professor Emeritus in the School of Law, and we've been close colleagues throughout the whole period of time that I've been here. and we'll hear more about that in a second. To stand here now and do this introduction on behalf of Anne-Marie, but also on behalf of colleagues, is a true honour. It's really significant and something that I'm incredibly proud to do. So thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for inviting me. I want to welcome the celebration of what has been a long overdue appointment as professor. Been professor for a while now, but it's much deserved. And we worked together for several years, and I was waiting for that day when it would inevitably happen. And to have an inaugural professorial lecture is really important, because every single person in this room is here because of you, and they're here to wish you well. They're also here to respect you and to thank you for the incredible work that you've achieved and that which you will do from now on. I want to particularly mention Anne-Marie's family and close friends who are here. It's a celebration that comes in the immediate context and aftermath of a family's loss. For Anne-Marie's father, Pat, recently passed away. But I know, knowing Anne-Marie as I do, and knowing some of the family as I do, that his spirit, Pat's spirit, his generosity, his love, and his commitment to those closest to him are with us right here, right now. Maria, Anne-Marie's mum, our collective condolences. Welcome. And also to Anne-Marie's sister, Patrina, and your family. To your wonderful partner, husband and best friend, Stephen, and also to your family. Oh yes, you know what's coming. A very special welcome to your sons, Ben and Luke. You should be so proud of you, Mum. I know you will be, and so are we. This community is proud, and we're proud specifically of the warmth and generosity that Anne-Marie brings to our lives. So, Professor McAlinden, it's going to be a whistle-stop tour through the last 2 decades of what has been a fine academic career to now, and outstanding achievement. I think most people in here know that you studied law at Queen's, followed by a master's in criminology and criminal justice, for which you gained a distinction, then to a doctorate for which you won the Royal Irish Academy Doctoral Scholarship, and another from Atlantic Philanthropies. Following that success, you were appointed as lecturer at the University of Ulster, and in 2003, you returned to Queen's as a lecturer in the School of Law. It was exactly the same moment that I walked through the door as well. And we've been friends ever since. In 2007, your primary research was a leading-edge contribution to what is a complex and often ill-informed popular debate. It led to the publication of The Shaming of Sexual Offenders, Risk, Retribution, and Reintegration. It was brave work. It was work for which you would know popular discourse wouldn't like you, that you would be possibly unfairly criticised for trying to understand one of the most significant issues of our time. And quite deservedly, your work won the 2008 British Society of Criminology Book Prize. It's a great book. What a start. What a start to a career as an author. Alongside that came numerous single-authored articles, and Anne-Marie needs to speak, otherwise I'd go through them all, published in international journals, each of which was subjected to strong, intense peer review. You researched and published a second book, Grooming and the Sexual Abuse of Children. One reviewer used two words that really stood out for me. He stated, "It was a book without peer. No one had achieved that which you achieved in that book." In 2015, with Dr. Claire Dwyer, you, one of our colleagues, you co-edited Criminal Justice in Transition, the Northern Ireland Context. This brought together 16 authors from our two universities. In the words of Professor Shad Maruna, who is here this evening, I just want to give the quote directly as he put it in the foreword. "You will put down the book and start to question everything you thought you understood and believed about justice." That is some tribute to you and to Claire, but also to our colleagues who contributed. But you were the catalyst. You made it happen. Your latest single-authored text is about to be published. Children at Risk: Sexual Exploitation and Abuse by Children and Young People. Another remarkable book. Another important book. Another book at the cutting edge, not only of academic discourse, but of popular discourse also. Internationally, Anne-Marie, your success as a researcher and writer is marked. You're a fine teacher and supervisor. I know. I've taught with you, I've supervised with you, both undergraduate and postgraduate. I've gained much from supervising doctoral students with you. Doctors Elizabeth Agnew and Gillian McNall, each examined only a few weeks ago, are here this evening. In our school, you are selfless. You've contributed consistently to its development, not least the dedication and leadership you've demonstrated as the school's Director of Research. We have all benefited from that. Whoever comes to your door, whenever they come to your door, you always respond generously. Your time, your advice, your knowledge. That goes unmarked in our work. It's not taken for granted, it just seems to be part of the job. And you are exceptional in what you bring to that. Anne-Marie, as your appraiser for several years, I know well the immense achievements of your teaching, your supervision, your research, your publications, and your major contribution to the school's success in the National Research Excellence Framework. I'm well known for my critique of the REF, but your work in the Research Excellence Framework stands out. It's remarkable. All this has been achieved in a period during which both your sons were born and have grown. Working evenings, weekends at home, on the bus, on the train, travelling to Newry and travelling from Newry. It's remarkable. Standing beneath one of the university's iconic paintings, those of you who are not aware of it, above me is a tribute to the women of this university, the women who work at every kind of job in this university. And it's a tribute to you. Given the focus of your research and the emotion involved in such sensitive work, Your academic rigour is matched by your personal resilience, supported, of course, by those around you. None of us are ourselves alone. We joined the school in the same month. A while later, I was about to teach a class and took a phone call from the women's prison, where I'd been with Linda Moore researching over the previous weeks. It was dreadful news. I was in tears. My partner, Dina, was out of immediate contact. I was due in class. I came to your door. I left your room and stood before 200 students. I shared my emotion with them. That day, I knew I had made a lifelong friend, whose personal support transcends, yet informs our shared commitment to rigorous academic scholarship, to social and political change. Anne-Marie, it was a defining moment, typifying the encouragement, counselling and warmth you readily give to others, your family, friends, colleagues, students. Profoundly, thank you. Please welcome Anne-Marie, Professor Anne-Marie McAlinden.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'm really delighted and honoured to see so many family, friends and colleagues here this evening. I really appreciate it. Before I begin the substantive lecture, I'd like to offer a number of thanks to different people. First of all, I'd like to thank the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences and the School of Law, and in particular Michael Alcorn, Richard Somerville, Declan Coyle and Linda Mahon for their help in organising and putting together tonight's event. Within the School of Law, as Phil mentioned, I've been very fortunate to work in a very supportive and productive research environment. Now, you might say, well, you would say that as the Director of Research for 5 years, but going back beyond that, I'm talking about from being a student and being a lecturer when I started. And there are a number of people who started out more senior than me and are still more senior, and from their support they've actually become good friends. And I'd like to thank, there are others, but I'm going to single out a few in particular. First of all, in particular, I'd like to thank Professor Kieran McAvoy, who I think he's at the back somewhere, but oh yes, I see him, yeah. Thank you. Professor Kieran McAvoy, who taught me on the Master's programme in Criminology and Criminal Justice, and it was Kieran who was instrumental in encouraging me to do a PhD and helped me to apply for funding to the Royal Irish Academy. And it was also Kieran who introduced me to the ideas, controversial as they then were, as Phil has highlighted, particularly when applied to sex offenders, of community reintegration and restorative justice. And more recently, I've been lucky to work with Kieran again on the Apologies Project with a few others, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I'm very grateful to Kieran for his mentoring and support and for being an intellectual sounding board for me throughout, particularly recently as well, but particularly the early part of my career. So thank you, Kieran. I'd also like to thank Professor Phil Scraton, who did the introduction. Thank you very much for your lovely introduction, Phil. Phil is now an Emeritus Professor. And Phil, as he said, has more recently been my mentor and appraiser. And Phil and I have supervised a number of PhDs together. You actually stole my thunder. I was going to mention Dr. Elizabeth Agnew and Dr. Gillian McNaull by name, but we've done it twice. Completions in the last couple of months. We've actually supervised 4 PhD students together, and I really will miss the supervisory meetings where Phil offered rich tea and sympathy to both me and the students in times of crisis. So thank you very much, Phil, for your mentoring and support. I really appreciate it, and your friendship. I would also like to thank my family and friends, and I'm really delighted that most of them are here this evening. I'd like to thank and acknowledge my mum, Maria, my sister, Bertrina, my brother-in-law, Stephen. It's not that long of a list, just bear with me. My husband, Stephen, my sons, Ben and Luke, Stephen's family, and also uncles and aunts and close friends, many of whom have travelled from Newry. So in different ways, you all support and encourage me, and I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful for that. But there are 2 very special people in particular I'd like to single out for support, without whom very definitely I wouldn't be standing here this evening. and the first of these is my husband, Stephen. So when I was 18 and came to Queen's as an undergraduate law student, I was very lucky to meet my best friend, and he's been with me ever since, through the highs and lows, both personal and professional. And again, as Phil has highlighted, to write a book, for example, as those of you who have done it will know, takes many long hours and evenings and weekends. And particularly when you have young children, that can't happen unless you have someone in the background doing absolutely everything else. So for everything you have done for me and for our family and continue to do for us, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much. I also actually have to highlight at this point my son Luke. I know you got to mention Luke, but Luke asked me to do this again. Luke made a card for me in school today, a good luck card, and when he gave it to me he said, "Does that mean I get to go up on the stage? Or you thank me from the stage?" No, but thank you, Luke, and thank you, Ben. Second and last, but by no means least, I also want to acknowledge my late father, Pat. As some of you will be aware, my father died just 5 weeks ago, and he is another person without whom very definitely I wouldn't be here. Both he and my mum provided a very productive and supportive and nurturing environment where there was support for education and learning. So whatever books we needed, from transfer test or 11 plus as it then was, right up to A-level revision guides, that was always bought for us. And in fact, up until the last decade or so before my dad lost his mobility, when he was out and about, he was always buying jotters or notebooks to give us anything that he thought in any way would help with learning. So several colleagues have said to me in the last few weeks, your dad would have been very proud of you. And I know that that is true, because he told both me and my sister on a regular basis how much he loved us and how very proud he was of us. So in that sense, this is every bit as much his celebration and achievement as it is mine. So if you're up there watching, Pat, and I know you are, just to say a thank you for everything you did for me, and this is for you. So a question I'm often asked by many people is, why sex offenders? Why this particular topic? And it's a fair question, because sex offenders are probably one of the most reviled and hated populations in the modern age. And I've been thinking about this, well, how did I actually get into this area? And it did stem from my master's thesis, which I did up in Lennoxville. I did a master's thesis on Megan's Law, which was a sex offenders register. It was just out under care and supervision. But going back even before that, I think I was always interested in this. The picture of Jack the Ripper there, which I'll qualify in a moment. But anybody who knows me on a personal level will know that I've been absolutely obsessed by Jack the Ripper since I was a teenager, reading everything possibly true crime I could get my hands on. I remember once actually coming back from Manchester Airport with my dad and being stopped by a customs man who opened up the hand luggage, and inside was a mixture of Catherine Cookson romance novels, all very innocent, mixed with Jack the Ripper DVDs and books, and the customs man visibly recoiled and said, "Whoa, that's some mixture, Catherine Cookson and Jack the Ripper." But I think I've always had an interest in the dark side of humanity and criminality. Just to say as well, though, I've used deliberately the image of Jack the Ripper to represent the notion of the othering, the dangerous predatory stranger. It's very important to highlight, as those who work in the area will well know, that sex offenders are a very diverse population. So far from it being confined to predatory adult males, it crosses age and gender, ethnic origin. So it's very important we keep that in the back of our minds. We shouldn't forget as well that it's also about victims and survivors, the other side of this. And depicted here are, some of these you probably will recognise, depicted here are some of the faces of children whose abuse and murder led to changes in the law. These were all pivotal or watershed moments in reframing the law around how we perceive risk and also child protection. So in the upper left-hand corner we have Sarah Payne, whose case led to Sarah's Law. Below that, Megan's Law, Megan Kanke in the United States. Both of those were instrumental in terms of the notification requirements and, crucially, what information could then be notified by the police to the local community. We have Hollywells and Jessica Chapman, who were murdered by Ian Huntley. If you remember Ian Huntley, the background check on Ian Huntley didn't show up the fact that he had previous convictions because he used an alias, which didn't show up on police computers. So that case led to a change in the law on pre-employment vetting and barring. In the middle, we have Jessica Lunsford, which is a case from Florida, whose case also led to tightening of the controls on sex offenders in the community. And at the right-hand side, we have 3 child protection cases. We have Baby P, Daniel Pelka, and Victoria Clembier. Not about this; those were cases of severe physical abuse and neglect and murder of children, but nonetheless all pivotal moments in how we see risk. And again, just as it's important to highlight with the perpetrator side of the coin, it's important to note as well that victims are not an homogenous group either. So yes, here we have sort of the ideal victim, which is the child, which I'll come back to later, but victims and survivors also includes adults, so vulnerable adults who were abused, adult women who were abused, adult males, adult survivors who were abused as children. So again, a very diverse population. Not all victims are the same, and they don't all want the same things. One thing that's also not very often acknowledged, which Phil kind of touched on, is the deeply emotional and human side of doing this particular work, particularly as a mother. Both my sisters-in-law, Sarah and Anne-Louise, who are also mothers, have said, I don't know how you do that type of work. And it does actually impact on you as well at a personal level. I remember once being at a conference and being at a panel at the end of the day of all the main speakers, and a question was posed from the floor, exactly that: how do you process, how do you cope with this type of work? And I think I was about third in on the panel, and the answer from the first guy was vodka. From the second person, white wine, and I said red wine. But joking aside, it's not without its personal challenges, particularly as a parent. And just one thing probably to add before I leave that is the last 2 slides taken together, the perpetrator side of the coin and the victim side of the coin. This balance of interests and the need to marry offender management with child protection a bit more is a key theme, and I'll come back to that towards the end. So overview of the lecture is 3 main things I want to talk about or focus on. First is the rise of risk philosophy, so our current thinking about risk, what it is, what our aims and objectives are, the language we use, the technologies or practices we put in place to give effect to that, the problems with risk when it comes to offender management or child protection, and finally how we can use some of the learning to reimagine risk. And throughout, what I want to do is to try and take a big picture approach. I want to sort of talk about some of the findings from the projects I've been involved in or led and the books I have written, and to pull out the learning in terms of risk and how we can use that to shape a better version of risk, if you like. So the rise of risk. So risk itself is basically based on the philosophy of neoliberalism. And I don't know why it's called that, because there's nothing liberal about it. It's essentially the philosophy of penal and criminal justice policy that has characterised the United States and the United Kingdom. And it's made up of 3 main measures. One is about social control of those who don't conform or deviants. It's also about incapacitation or public protection, so locking people up, resulting in high rates of imprisonment. And it's also about targeted intervention with groups that are seen to be at risk, particularly, such as sex offenders. And what that results in then is a policy of what is known as preemptive governance or preemptive approaches to risk, where the idea is essentially you try and put in place measures to prevent all possible future manifestations of risk, to govern pre-crime or the worst case scenario from occurring. And the key features of the risk paradigm are as follows. So it's about gathering knowledge about offenders, their behaviour and whereabouts, then using that information to classify offenders into risk categories, particularly or usually low risk, medium risk and high risk, though England and Wales have a 4th category of very high risk. It's then about putting in place appropriate management strategies based on that category of risk. So, for instance, low-risk offenders are usually managed by a single agency, such as probation, whereas higher-risk offenders would normally be managed on a multi-agency basis, so by the police and social services and probation. It's also about surveillance, things like electronic tagging, the sex offenders register I've mentioned, and the upshot of this is about increasing security and public protection. So the 3 words in bold really classify what risk is about. It's about using knowledge to manage to increase public protection or security. And on the right-hand side, I've sort of given you an extreme example of this, of what are known as shame penalties, which are used by judges in the United States. And this is where a judge might impose, as part of probation conditions, that a known sex offender self-notify to the community that they're a registered sex offender, which can happen in a number of ways. One is where you go around giving out flyers to your neighbours, like postcards that has your photograph, your offence details. Other ways are to post a sticker on your bumper sticker on your car, or a placard in your yard which basically says, "Danger, registered sex offender lives here." Now, we haven't gone that far here, thank goodness, but those examples in other jurisdictions do exist. So the first project I want to talk about is the book stemming from my PhD. It ended up dramatically different from the PhD, but the nucleus was there. And the central argument of this book was that current criminal justice approaches to sex offender management do not work. They're about punishment and they're about retribution, which results in the opposite of what we want. It doesn't result in reintegration into the community in the longer term. It results in disintegration, or what John Braithwaite famously termed disintegrative shaming. And that happens because we label offenders, and by labelling people as sex offenders, we create a stigma, then we isolate them from the rest of the law-abiding community, and that can lead then to reoffending behaviour as a coping mechanism. But what we actually want to work towards instead is reintegrative shaming, which focuses on the behaviour as bad or harmful or wrong, and not the individual. So it's not the fact that you're a bad person that we're talking about, it's what you have done is wrong. And one measure which encapsulates that is circles of support and accountability, which originated in Canada but have been used in other jurisdictions such as Northern Ireland and England and Wales. And circles basically work as follows. You have a circle comprised of 10 to 12 members of the local community, along with statutory and voluntary agencies, who form this circle around the sex offender who is a core member. And the twin philosophies are safety and support. It's about providing daily checks on the offender's whereabouts and on behaviour in the high-risk phase just after release. So it's about community safety. But crucially, it's also about support for the offender in the practical aspects of reintegration, such as finding a job or accommodation. So I think the findings from this book, what that basically tells us is, yes, we need risk management, but we have to balance that with strengths and needs. We have to look at what's going on in the offender's life and look at providing more tailored structural social supports to aid in reintegration. And I'll come back to that. My second book, one that took me about 2 or 3 years to write by the time I did the fieldwork, but I'm going to sum it up in 2 to 3 minutes, thankfully for you. Was funded by the British Academy, and this was based on over 50 interviews with professionals, so police, lawyers, judges, probation, social services, psychologists, victim support, etc., who worked in the 4 jurisdictions of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, so England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, grooming is a term subject to much misapprehension in the media and popular discourse. So one good example, I think, is a number of years ago, there was a headline in the Belfast Telegraph which read, "Child dinner lady's warning over biscuit." So essentially a child dinner lady gave a primary school child, a second biscuit, and was warned by her employers that she could potentially be criminalised for grooming. So it's a subject that can be overused, and it's subject to a lot of apprehension. The 2 forms the public are most sort of au fait with and familiar with are online, so the predatory stranger making contact with a child online to groom them offline, and also grooming within institutions such as residential care homes or schools, and both of those do happen. But this book also highlighted that grooming can also occur in familial context. It's not just extra-familial, but it does operate slightly differently. So if you think of what grooming is generally, some scholars look at it as a single process. What I said was there's 2 parts to it. First of all, it's not just about getting access to the child to create the opportunity to abuse. It's also crucially about stopping that abuse being discovered or the child disclosing. So within the family context, then you can say the father or uncle or mother, whoever it happens to be, doesn't have to groom to get access. They're already there. Grooming in that context is much more about keeping the abuse going, the maintenance of abuse. Grooming is also a staged process, which also is highly relevant for how the law responds to this. So it usually begins by befriending the child, getting to know their interests, trying to set up an exclusive relationship, which then distances the child from the parents or protective others, then gradually introducing sexualised themes such as pornography or telling dirty jokes, gradually culminating in sexual contact. And the significance of the sexualised themes is it creates complicity on the part of the child and guilt, and they're less likely to tell. But because so much of the early stages of grooming is about befriending, getting to know the child, it's very, very difficult to pinpoint grooming. It's only something usually that's easily identifiable with the benefit of hindsight. And that's because much of the early stages of grooming is about befriending. So it becomes very difficult in practice then to separate out an innocent or innocuous motivation towards a child from something that is much more harmful or sinister before a contact sexual offence has actually happened. Now, it's much easier in the digital world because if the police get computers, you have that digital footprint, as they term it, or a digital chain of evidence. You can see the chat logs and you can see the gradual sexualised contact. But because abuse is very clandestine anyway and happens in private, it's very difficult to capture grooming in law before an actual contact sexual offence. So because of the limitations of the law in trying to respond to harm on a preemptive way, I think we need to be more creative here and look at public health approaches in terms of early identification and prevention, a much more proactive rather than reactive response, and I'll come back to that. The further project I want to talk about and draw out some of the findings is desistance from sex offending. And this was an ESRC funded project where I was the PI in conjunction with Professor Shad Maruna and also Dr. Mark Farmer, who was then of the National Offender Management Service in England and Wales, which is now HM Prisons and Probation. And Mark did the fieldwork and he got his PhD from the study. And the study was essentially based on life story interviews with 32 convicted child sex offenders. So the grim is pretty grim. So essentially the offenders were asked about their life in stories or chapters. So tell me about your early life, your childhood, your adolescence, your first job, going to school, your friendships, the lead up to the offence, being apprehended by the police, the aftermath of that, and their current life. And each of those offenders were under the supervision of the probation service for England and Wales at the time, and as far as we knew, they had not committed another offence within a 3-year period. And the high risk phase is the closest phase after release, so we thought it was fairly reliable. Now, what came out of that study was the importance of work and relationships for the men in the study, but it was very different from how work and relationships work for offenders who are not sexual offenders. So let me explain, probably I should have said this a moment ago, of what desistance actually is. The term really means what you think it is. It's about slowing down or stopping offending. That's exactly what it is. Now, from the literature on desistance from non-sexual crime, every other type of offence other than sexual crime, work and relationships are very much turning points. In other words, finding a good job or the love of a good woman, as some scholars put it, that's a turning point in making the offender go straight and no longer reoffend. That wasn't the case with the men in this study. For many of them, they had work and relationships leading up to their offending. Some did lose them, but work and relationships were significant in a lifelong way, not just as a turning point. The significance of work and relationships, though, was important in the sense of giving the men in the study a future focus. So the narratives of all the men we deemed to be desisting rather than persisting offenders, those who did reoffend or were at risk of reoffending, was that they all had hope and optimism for the future. They all clung to or aspired to getting a good job or holding on to their job or finding a new relationship or keeping hold of the current one that they had in terms of their identity as a non-sex offender going forward. So the implications of this then for how we think about risk, I think, are twofold. While I have used the terms sex offender, victim throughout, I think we have to be very careful about labels. In particular, I think as desistance theorists are starting to look at this as well, I think we need to be more creative in how we talk about sex offending. And in particular, it seems completely counterintuitive to label somebody as a sex offender if we don't want them to be a sex offender. If we're trying to manage risk with the very purpose of longer term reintegration and reducing risk, why do we keep calling them sex offenders? So we need to think more creatively about that. Crucially as well, I think we also need to rethink sex offender treatment programmes. If you look at this slide and the previous one before that, grooming is very much in the lead up to the offence, which the significance of that would tend to promote a backward-looking approach or a confessional approach to treatment. In other words, where the offender in therapy is asked about, well, tell me in the lead up to your offence, how did you think and feel about your victim? We actually need to balance that, thinking about desistance and future-focused work, on forward-looking approaches as well. I think the current trend in treatment is going towards more future-focused approach, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the backward-looking element as well from work like grooming. And I think we need to find and maintain that balance between a backward and forward-looking ethos of treatment. And a further project I want to talk about is my current one, a book just published by CUP funded by NOTA, a small research grant by NOTA. And this is looking at peer forms of abuse, so sexual exploitation and abuse by children and young people. And the ethos of this book, or the aim of it, was basically to look at, well, where does the threshold of risk crystallise? There's so much in the media now about young people and sexting and cyberbullying, and a panic almost, if you like. So where should the law and does the law intervene? Now, the problem with this area is that children are traditionally seen as being at risk of offending rather than posing a risk themselves. And that's because children are, as we know, the ideal victim. If you think of victimhood as a pyramid, children are at the apex of that because they're the ideal victim. They're innocent, they're young, they're pure, they're passive, and therefore blameless. But in fact, research shows that between 33, this is a sort of review of published studies, and also from some of the data I got from internal data I got from agencies across Northern Ireland, between 33 and 50% of all child sexual abuse is committed by those under 18. Now, only a very small number end up in the justice system for a number of attrition reasons, which I'll not go into, but it is a significant problem. And it takes a number of forms. So it can happen within families, between siblings. It can happen in institutions such as care homes or schools. It can happen online, such as sexting or cyberbullying. It can also happen within peers more broadly. It can happen in organised and gang contexts, such as child sexual exploitation. One of the big sort of challenges here is the cultural sexualisation of childhood and the sort of subliminal messages about sex that children and young people receive, which distorts the normative context for peer-based sexual behaviours. So things like the media, so celebrity culture, advertising, film, gaming, music industries all promote sexualised images of children at an increasingly early age. You have social media and the use of mobile phones, which can tend to distort the boundaries between real-world or virtual contexts and offline contexts. Sometimes it can act as an emotional filter where people, adults as well as children, tend to say and do things via social media or their mobile phone that they wouldn't do in a real-world context. You also have access to pornography. It's 2 or 3 clicks away on a phone. You have the party culture, and with drugs and alcohol as inhibitors, you can have a kind of passing round that happens. So it can go on and on, but there's a multitude of factors that's changing the normative context for how children and young people think about and view sex. And what that is doing is it's distorting the boundary between coercion and consent. And it becomes very difficult both for children and young people, for parents and carers, and also professionals to draw the line. So if not the fact that everybody's doing this, but if the normative context has changed and this is the new normal, how do we then separate behaviour which is normal or experimental and part of adolescent developing sexuality from something that is more risky or potentially problematic in the middle to something at the upper end that is actually probably very clearly harmful and exploitative? It's a very difficult one, and the law is playing catch up. And one of the big problems here is that the law is using child protection frameworks that was implemented to protect children from adult abusers. So it's using child pornography legislation, indecent images legislation to capture sexting. So we have a long way to catch up here. I think what this tells us is that, again, not to lose sight of risk management, but I think we need to balance concerns with risk and vulnerability and protection of children with the need to increase their personal resilience. Now, that does not mean placing the protection of children squarely on the shoulders of children and young people. But I think risk alone will not do this. It's about trying to support children in their developing capacity and competency as young adults. And I'll come back to some of that. And the final project I want to talk about before sort of pulling this together is Apologies, Abuses and the Past. This is an ongoing ASRC funded study where the PI is Professor Kieran McAvoy in conjunction with a number of colleagues across the school and the faculty. So we have Dr. Mers McCarta, Dr. Anna Bryson, Dr. Lauren Dempster and Professor Shad Maruna. And there are 3 areas or 3 case studies. We have the conflict, the banking crisis and institutional child abuse, and I'm leading on the institutional child abuse strand. Now, the issue is here that there are very few published studies on abuse in institutional context. There are a few, but not as many as there would be about child sexual abuse, perhaps in extra-familial contexts. So the problem is then that most of what we know about institutional child abuse stems from public inquiries and reviews. So we had a lot of these in the South in the last number of years in the Republic of Ireland. We had Ferns, Murphy, Cloyne, the Ryan Report, the most famous, the McAlinden Report. We had the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland, which reported in January 2017. And we had the Royal Commission in Australia, which reported in December 2017. But there are slight variations in their terms of reference, but invariably the focus very much is on responses to allegations, what the church or state knew and when it knew it. How did they respond to allegations, their failure to respond to allegations or suspicions of abuse? Now, the problem with that is that it really does not focus on the causes of abuse. So things like institutional grooming, which I would have looked at. What is it about an institutional environment that makes that so conducive to abuse? The context in which abuse occurred, and I'll come back to some of those in the following points in a minute. And also, very importantly, the lifelong consequences of abuse for survivors, adult survivors who were abused as children. Because it's not just about sexual abuse, it's about severe physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, even things like the lack of a basic caring environment, a nurturing, warm environment, denial of education. Other bits that are missed sort of in the inquiries are abuse by peers and laity. So it's not just about risk stemming from religious or authority figures. Because abuse was normalised, children were also abused by other children in organisations, and a minority of the inquiry shows us that. They were also abused by laity, so lay visitors who come in to the institution to work. Another missing point that's important to emphasise is the opportunistic situational nature of offending. Only a small proportion of sex offending is actually predatory or preferential. The majority of sexual offending is opportunistic or situational, and that means that it occurs as a result of a combination of factors. It occurs where you have a motivated offender, whether that's conscious or unconscious, where you have an available victim, and you have no other capable adults around to provide protection. So now there are some individuals who do no doubt target organisations in order to abuse, but that's not the majority. So again, what that tells us about risk is we need to very much look at harm and abuse, its causes and context, how we configure harm and measure harm and quantify it and classify it, and risk in a much wider context. So the problems with risk, there are a few of them, but I've pulled out 4 here. So the first of these is known by scholars as the homogeneity of risk, i.e. all risks are the same, and they're not. So public policy, to some extent, but certainly public discourse and media discourse would be focused on the predatory high-risk sex offender. All sex offenders are paedophiles, and they all pose the same degree of high risk. It's much more nuanced than that. I'll come back to some of this. Zero-sum thinking, as Pat O'Malley terms it, that victims and perpetrators are completely opposite groups, that they're diverse interests, rights and needs, and again, that's also not the case. It's about managerialism, it's about short-term control rather than longer-term change. We need to fix that. And it's also about elitist decision-making. So it's the state that's making the decisions with very little involvement of the local community. So what we need to do in terms of reimagining risk is to look at the language, objectives and techniques we use. We need to think about how we talk about and frame sex offending, the aims and objectives that we give priority to within the criminal justice system and public policy, and then at the end, how we give effect to those aims and objectives through the strategies or processes we put in place. So in terms of the language of risk, we need to recognise, as one interviewee put it in the last project, the Children as Risk book, that there are layers of risk. Risk is much more nuanced than we currently give it credit for. It has age and gender dimensions and also race, as I've mentioned. The victim-offender continuum is absolutely key. Now that does not mean simply that a victim abuses a child will then go on to become an adult abuser. That does happen, but it's only in about 50% of cases. What it does mean more crucially is that in complex forms of abuse like child sexual exploitation, a child can be both a victim and a perpetrator at the same time in an organised context. So within a group or organised context, such as in a school or if it's a gang or whatever, With child sexual exploitation, you can have a child or an adolescent who is a victim at the hands of somebody else, but also wielding power over and abusing another person. So it's very complex, and I think what the law tends to do is, in those complex cases, is deal with the person as an offender first, and the victimhood bit can be left for mitigation in the courts. That should not happen. We need to be much more au fait with the fact that these cases are very complex, and we need to bring these approaches together at the same time from investigation at the early stages. We need to remove the labels, as I've said, paedophile, sex offender. If we want people to not be these things, why do we use the labels? And we need to be much more nuanced in how we use terms such as victim and offender. Terms like vulnerability, as I've said, someone could have dual vulnerabilities as both a victim and a perpetrator. In terms of objectives, I said at the very start, the importance of balancing the victim and offender perspective. And I'll read you a quote here from the book on grooming from a senior social worker in Edinburgh, just the bold parts. You can't talk about child protection without talking about the offender. The victim and the offender have to be together, and that has never been done. I think it should be looked at, child protection and offender management, as two different sides of the one coin. Now, it's starting to happen, but we need to do more. You tend to have siloed thinking where you have public protection, offender management, and child protection, and never the twain shall meet. We need much more integration of this. We need to think about longer-term reintegration or tertiary assistance, not just short-term risk management. We need to look at longer-term change rather than control. As I've said, we need to think about public protection in broader terms, early intervention and prevention, which I'll come back to in the next couple of slides at the end. In terms of processes, we need to encourage community participation much more beyond the current ad hoc initiatives as part of, the lay advisors to the public protection arrangements or the odd circle of support. We need to look very much at the structural aspects of reintegration, so the social context in which the offender is placed is as important as the individual background of that offender. We need to balance the structural or the social much more with the individual. We also need to balance affective and effective dimensions of justice. So it's not just about reconviction rates or clear-up rates. What the data tells us that we're clearing up crime or controlling crime. We need to look at the emotional aspect of offending. For the offender's family, very, very crucial, very few programmes in place for the offender's family. That's very difficult when it comes to interfamilial abuse. If the abuser and the victim are from the same family, we have a few good programmes. We need to do more. We need more programmes for young people. And again, back all the time to public education, identification and protection. So summing all that up, before I just draw out in the last few slides the implications of this for criminal justice and society, we need to basically turn the risk paradigm on its head. So if you think of risk as a pyramid, and at the very top you have the small number of high-risk offenders. We need to invert that, turn that upside down, and we need to change our focus on the core question we're asking. So we're asking, why is it that sex offenders re-offend or offend? We're focusing on recidivism, re-offending. We need to change that question to, why is it that they don't? Looking at the majority, why do the majority not offend? So look at desistance and reintegration, not just risk. Here we have the pyramid again, focusing on this top sort of yellow part of the pyramid. So how this is played out then is public education is key for children and young people in schools, for parents around what is normal, what is consent, but in a broader context, not just about sex offending, about risk, but about consent, privacy, respect for yourself, others, and not in a heteronormative context either, that it's males and females only. Much more identification needs to be done in recognition of the multiple sexual identities that children and young people have. Programmes for young abusers and families I've mentioned, and true joined up thinking by joining together offender management side of the house and the child protection. We need to help offenders forge a new non-offending identity, remove labels. The second one's very, very difficult to do. Get society to recognise the ubiquitous nature of child sexual abuse. It can happen in any home, in any school, in any workplace. Programmes, as I've said, to balance the forward and backward-looking approaches, and much more inclusionary rather than exclusionary elitist policies that recognise the interests and involve offenders, families, victims and the community. The societal challenges are also manifold, Public attitudes and mindsets. There was a study I did for the NIO, now the Department of Justice, on public attitudes to sex offenders in Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland repeated it a number of years ago, and particularly for child sex offenders, those who offend against children, the data is stark. Nobody wants, it's not in my backyard, nobody wants these individuals living beside them. So we need to put in place supports, education to try and address some of the punitiveness, the ignorance, the stigma and the shame that exists around sex offending as well. It's very difficult to talk about sex and sexuality in Northern Ireland still because of sort of its history. We need to try and get over some of this shame. And there's still, unfortunately, a shame that attaches to both being a perpetrator and a victim. So we need to address all of this. Pro-social supports for offenders, a broader range of work programmes in particular. We need to address the cultural sexualisation of children. So on the one hand, we're trying to protect them. On the other hand, we think it's okay to sell padded bras for 9-year-olds in Primark and pole dancing kits in Tesco for 8-year-olds. So and ultimately there, we need to recognise child protection as everybody's responsibility. It's not just the preserve of statutory and voluntary agencies. We all have a role to play. So finally, what I've said is then, reimagining risk involves some of the following elements. It's about balancing victim and offender perspectives. It's about having offender-focused strategies as well as offence-focused strategies, so looking at behaviour as a class as well as individuals. We need to engage not just offenders, but the society in which they're released into. And we need a whole system approach to prevention and protection, which involves children in schools, education, parents and carers, media, social media, as well as society and statutory and voluntary agencies. I'll leave it there. Thank you.